and so forth. That's the question. Okay? So you have to look at the composition, what is mostly within this area, and it's mostly residential. Now, if it is mostly residential, you can think about, okay, what is the income to the city if you are to run a city out of all that money? It'll be out of property taxes, right? So the question is, can the area generate enough property taxes to sustain the city? It's a question. I do not have the answer. Okay, but someone has to show me the numbers, in order to convince me that there is enough money in the area to do it. Many years ago, when they first talked about this, it was before the car dealerships moved out of, I think it is on Fulton and also on Auburn for the most part. They had a lot of new car lots, back then. Have you guys been to Fulton or Auburn lately?
I just went down there today and noticed all the empty car lots.
Yeah, so where are the car dealerships?
They went bankrupt. They folded those.
Well, or moved somewhere else. They might have consolidated with some other dealerships. But anyway, they're no longer around. So the question is, without those car dealerships, which was a major part of the income within this area, will this particular area still make enough money? So I don't know. Nobody has shown me the math. They just promise and say, no new taxes, but better services. Okay? But they can promise anything they want. But I need the math, I need the numbers to convince myself, that they will actually be able to do it. Okay, and this is something that we have not talked about in this class. Whether it is it's worth it to spend $500 more to soup up a computer. Okay, so the question is, what are you buying for $500? It depends. Okay, but mostly you're buying time. The argument of buying a more expensive computer that is more powerful is you don't need to upgrade the computer for, it will last longer, okay? It won't be phased out or out of date or obsolete, for a longer period of time. So the question now is, how much longer, okay? And what you need to do in that case is to use Moore's law. Have we talked about Moore's law in this class? Moore's law says, it is, you double the processing speed about every 18 months or so. So once you take that into effect, then you have to ask the question, the $500 that you are spending, how much performance are you buying for that $500? If it is 20% or 30%, it translates to literally a few months. So you're buying a few months of time using $500. Is it worth the money? That's the question. Okay? And that takes math too. That takes math, and not only just regular math, it also takes exponent. This is not linear. This is all exponential. And needless to say, math is also needed to understand how much the 0 to 60 time or quarter mile, if you want, a 400 horsepower engine will shave as opposed to a 300 horsepower engine. Okay, now that's a big question to many of us, because the octane heads, usually want to find out, if I spend the extra money to get those 100 extra horses, how much faster will my car go? That's the question. My first answer usually is shave the pounds. Don't increase the horsepower, shave the pounds first. Because on my way here, I saw, there was one excursion and there was one Ram 2500 just raising their way up, Eastern, Avenue. And I was thinking, if you want to drive fast, get a Miata. get a 2,200-pound car, add a turbo to it, and you can go really fast, and still have about 30 miles to a gallon. Yep.
A good example though of the BMW 7 Series, which is like
a boat.
Huh?
A boat.
Yeah. It's like. It's got the V8 engine.
It needs the V8 engine.
Yeah, because it's got like 6,000 pounds on it.
An Excursion is more than 6,000 pounds.
Yeah.
A Ford Excursion is like a huge, big monster. Yep. But that's all math. So the question is, is this stuff important to a common person? Not a programmer, not a mathematician, not someone who is in the computer science area. Is this stuff still important to a normal person? And I think it is. So I have one last comment before I have to send the email. I'm sure the article gets applause from credit card companies, lenders, casinos, and lotto operators, because we don't want to understand the chances and the probabilities of winning lotto, do we? Because once you understand, you're not going to buy any lotto tickets anymore, or going to a casino for that matter. Now, going to a casino does not need math. How can they pay all the electricity for all the neon lights if they're losing money to people who go there? It's just logic, right? So anyway, I just felt that, I just kind of felt compelled that I have to share this with you guys.
Did you send that to him?
No, not to him. Just send it to my department. Yep. If I send this stuff to the author, it would just be to deaf ears. Who am I to comment on his piece, right? I mean, he's a well-known professor of some kind from the University of Illinois.
Professor denouncing that?
He's actually a professor. How do you call a professor who has left the job? Emeritus.
Yeah.
So he apparently has been a professor in math, statistics, and computer science. All of
We
it.
don't need it.
Hmm?
And telling us we don't need it.
Yep. Well, a common person does not need it. And I think it's good. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a comment. 60 Minutes has been doing these kind of pieces on parts of the country that have really, really high unemployment rates, people exceeding the unemployment check periods. And my boyfriend and I both really noticed that every person they're profiling and interviewing, they all do jobs that require no math. They were all administrative type jobs, doing things, personnel management, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it made us both really comment. There's a noticeable difference between the people who are still employed now,
Mm-hmm.
and that's maybe not as a generalization, but I would disagree with that professor as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This is kind of funny because you were saying that he was a science, computer science teacher.
Yep.
You were saying that.
Yep.
Well, you did that job, but when you were telling us that story about how you and the other guy had to come up with that program, what was the first thing you both did?
Well, but that was a made-up story just to make sure that you guys pay attention, right?
I thought it was real.
How you thought that was real?
I was like, oh, my professor.
My previous employer would have kept me, even if I were to lose that, competition. All right. Well, so I guess we can return back to the regular stuff for about 20 minutes because remember, I do have to leave a little early today. Yep.
In theory, you could just go to Wikipedia and get all of your programs, couldn't you?
You mean to learn how to write programs?
To learn and just to get all of the stuff you need to write your own.
Okay, Wikipedia is a huge body of knowledge.
Yeah, but you can technically go anywhere. So then
Say that again.
You could go anywhere on the internet. You can get any information you need. So the point of math, necessary of math, is technically just let other people know that can teach you. So you could just skip over math. I think that's
But you won't understand the stuff on Wikipedia.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about it.
Right.
I'm just saying that what I think he was trying to say was you can learn from other people who already know.
No, he is basically saying, well, you guys can read the article, but what he is saying is you don't actually, a person whose occupation does not need math, does not really need to, take that many math classes in elementary school, middle school, and high school. He's basically arguing if you cannot learn it as a child intuitively, you don't need it. You have to read the full article. You can
Even to be a waitress, you need math. I mean, you need.
You need not only math in that case, you need fast, quick math too.
Yeah, for sure.
You need to stop your customer. Hey, wait! You come back here.
Yeah, but I mean, how do you balance a checkbook? I mean, you even living off of a debit card, you have to know how much is in your bank account, so you have to be able to subtract.
Or understand what is compound interest versus simple interest. That's a big thing too. So anyway, I think this class in general probably agrees that math is important. I mean, the more math you can learn, it cannot hurt at least. Okay, it might hurt during the time when you're taking the class, but afterwards, it cannot hurt. All right, so we're moving on to local variables with subroutines. So before we move on to local variables, just like this, I'm going to use a sample program to illustrate why it is needed. Okay. So what I will do is I will say, define the subroutine. So this is all related to subroutines. I will define the subroutine called add3. That's all it does. Okay. And I would even go through the trouble of using a loop to add 3 to a particular variable. Okay. So I'm going to set up a counter first. I is my counter. I will say while I is less than 3. Okay. I usually have a do here. I would say x gets x plus 1, I gets I plus 1, and while, and define sub. I am hoping that most people will look at this code and recognize what it is going to do. Because what I'm doing here is, okay, these lines are fairly standard. I gets initialized to 0 because I is a counter of sorts. The boundary is when I is less than 3, I continue in the loop. When I gets to 3 or at least 3, I get out of the loop as soon as possible. For each iteration, I'm adding 1 to I. Okay, that should be a fairly common or recognized, well-recognized pattern, for loops now. And for each iteration, I'm adding 1 to x. So the effect of invoking add3 should be just adding 3 to x. Are we convinced of this? Yep.
So 3 would be like a bar a bar?
No. There's no bar a bar. There's no arrays here.
Just like
X is just a variable. I'm adding 3 to x. Okay. So now, if I write a different subroutine, define sub add 6. Okay. I can use the same logic, and I can say this time I only have to do something twice. What I'm doing twice is invoking add3, and then I say I gets I plus 1, and while, and define sub. This subroutine, on the other hand, should add 6 to variable x, because it's going to call add3 twice, right? Because if you add 3 twice, to a variable, you're adding 6 to that variable. Is that making any sense? And then you can look at the structure of this add 6 subroutine. We initialize a counter to 0. We specify that as long as it is less than 2, we go for another iteration. And within the loop, we add 1 to the counter. It seems like the same type of logic, and since this time I changed the comparison to 2 instead of 3, it should do it only twice, right? So at least superficially, these two subroutines together should add 6 to a variable x. So outside of this, we'll just go ahead and initialize x to a particular value. It doesn't matter what it is. We can initialize that to 11. And then I'll just invoke add 6. And after this subroutine returns, it should give me a result of 17. Because 11 plus 6 is 17. The question is it going to do that? Now, since I asked the question that way, you know for sure that it's not going to do it like that. Okay, right? So the question is, what exactly is it going to do? Let's go ahead and trace this algorithm just to find out what it is going to do and where the problem is. Because as you trace the algorithm, you will probably just pick up and say, I think the problem has to be here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and use another window to keep track of the trace. Comments, line number, and we have 2 global variables here. We have x and we have I. So right away, it should ring a bell. There should be, a bell, ding, going.